Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Dorset Council's Overview and Scrutiny Resources Committee. This is a special additional meeting that has been convened to look at reviewing the Council's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Before we kick off into the main meeting, I'd just like to take a moment. Some of you on the committee and in the public may be aware that our Vice Chairman, Councillor Mike Parks, is a retained firefighter over in Ferndown, and therefore, along with hundreds of his colleagues, has spent the best part of the last 2 or 3 weeks in Wareham Forest tackling the major fire that's been taking place there. And I just thought it was a pertinent time to pay thanks to him, but also his colleagues for the amazing work that they do keeping us safe, because it is at the forefront of many of our minds. So Mike, I would just like to say thank you on behalf of me, and I'm sure that the rest of the committee would like to pass that on as well. And if you could please pass on our thanks to your colleagues as and when you see them, that would be greatly appreciated, because you do amazing work that many of us probably do not have the bravery to do ourselves. So thank you. This is our first virtual committee meeting for this committee, so I'm just going to explain how we hope it's going to run. So we have a group of cabinet members and our senior officers are here to answer any questions the committee might have. We're going to go in turn around committee members who will have the opportunity to ask their questions, which I imagine they've pre-prepared, but ask them one at a time, allowing after the response for any committee member to ask any pertinent follow-up questions on that subject. We are aware that there is a lot of ground to cover in this meeting because our response to COVID-19 has touched every part of the organisation. So if we find ourselves taking a deep dive into a subject, my recommendation is going to be that we set up a working group to sit down with subject matter experts in that department and a group of councillors who are knowledgeable in that sector to then really do that deep work and make sure that the lessons are learnt at a micro level, not just a macro level as well. So if we find ourselves going down that, I will try and flag that at that point, and we will start a sort of a list of any working groups that may be required at that time. I think it's also worth noting at this time that we have special guests joining the committee side in the forms of Councillor Matt Hall, who is the chair of the Audit and Governance Committee, Councillor Jill Haynes, who is the chair of the Overview and Scrutiny for Health, Councillor Jane Somper, who is the chair for the Overview and Scrutiny for People, and Councillor Darryl Turner, who is the chair of the Overview and Scrutiny for Place. For all intents and purposes, with the exception of voting on any resolutions the committee might come to, they are going to be considered full-fledged members of the committee. We've also asked all councillors from across the authority to submit any questions that they would like asked of our panelists during today's discussions, and our clerk will read those out, the ones that we've received so far throughout the proceedings, and therefore allow the panel members to ask any follow-up questions that might be pertinent to that subject. So we will start the meeting. Firstly, I haven't received any apologies. Has anyone on the committee received any? I'll give you 5 seconds. Okay, that's great. Does any of the members of the committee have any declarations of interest? Okay, I haven't heard anything, so that's good. Moving on to the minutes from the meeting of the 26th of November and the 13th of January. Does anybody have any comments on the accuracy of those minutes? Okay, again, I haven't received any requests to speak, so unless anyone has any objections or wishes to abstain, I'm going to assume that everyone is in favour of those minutes as a true and accurate record. I'll give you a few seconds to make comment. Okay, I will sign those next time we can meet in the office again. I will need to write a reminder to not forget. We haven't had any public participation requests. And now moving on to the main agenda item. Before we start, I think it's worth taking a moment to remember why we're here. We are here because a global pandemic has shaken Dorset to its very core. A global pandemic has very tragically taken in excess of 350 people from Dorset from us prematurely, leaving behind friends and families who are trying to grieve and grieve at a time when our social support networks are fragmented. I don't think it could be a tougher time to lose a loved one right now. And I hope that everyone on the committee would join me in saying to those people who are trying to deal with that, we hope you have the time to grieve and the time to come to terms with your loss. And of course, if there's anything we can do to help, we would be happy to try and do so. I think it's also pertinent to remember that this pandemic has reminded me of what makes Dorset great, and I apologise to anyone here. I don't believe that is Dorset Council. I believe that is the people of Dorset. We've seen our communities mobilise in a volunteer way that I don't think any of us had ever dreamt would happen, and that is an amazing credit to us. We've seen, community groups set themselves up to supply the most vulnerable in our community with shopping, with prescriptions, or maybe just someone to talk to. And the most humbling example of that, I think, was a member of one of my communities who only speaks German, and we managed to find a native German speaker for him to talk to, because he can no longer obviously leave the house because he was shielding. These community groups have saved lives and made people's lives much better off, and to me that is something that we should celebrate in this dark hour, but is something that we need to learn from and try and harness going forward. We have community groups who are oversubscribed with volunteers, so to all of those people who've given up their time to help someone they've never met before, the words thank you have probably never felt so inadequate, but yet so right at the same time. So thank you for what you're doing, and I hope that we can learn lessons on how we can best support you and support the community of Dorset today. So with that, I would like to pass over to Councillor Spencer Flowers, who is the leader of Dorset Council. And can I ask all members on the first time that they come up on the screen to introduce themselves as to who they are? Spencer.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Just the opportunity, I'm very grateful for the opportunity to speak to Scrutiny today. All of you on the line will appreciate how important I attach to Scrutiny and the role that it plays in the council. You talk about learning, Chairman, and I think the learning we've had in the last 3 months or so has been massive. I think we've learned a lot of new skills, a lot of ways. We've been very agile in the way the council's approached the dealings of dealing with COVID. And then this is an important meeting today because we had our first cabinet meeting and we had the item on the agenda. As you know, we took an awful long time presenting the report, and rightly so. Tremendous amount of work's gone on, but it's only right and proper that we reflect now to see whether there's any lessons we can continue to learn from the experiences over the last 3 months and how we take this forward. So, you know, I look at the recommendation, and it's quite clear it's the effectiveness of the role we've played in the crisis and all that learning. And it's also, and you'll know this, Chairman, very, very important that we focus on the responsibilities of the council rather than other agencies. There's other place where that can take place. But certainly today, I hope colleagues across the council chamber will appreciate that this is about what Dorset Council did and the responsibilities it had and was given by government to deal with the impact of this, as you say, pandemic. I don't think I'm going to say much more because I really want to, quite frankly, I want to sit and listen and pick up and get some knowledge around what others felt about the overall achievements of the council. Thank you very much, Chairman.
Matt Prosser, would you like to say some few words before we begin?
Yes, thank you, Chair, and thank you, Councillor Flower. So, Matt Prosser, Chief Executive of Dorset Council. And as Chief Executive, whilst I would not have wanted to have been leading an organisational response to a global pandemic and the suffering and hardship it has and will continue to bring to our communities, it's nevertheless been a privilege to serve the people of Dorset during this time. The community, business and organisational response, I think, has been exceptional. I hope you will see that through the report. But nevertheless, as Councillor Flower said, taking learning along the way is absolutely important. This report focuses on the period up until the 20th of April when it was published, and I invite, as Councillor Flower has done, to consider the report against those recommendations. Are you assured of the effectiveness of Dorset Council's response to COVID-19 up until that point? Further reports will come. We've got an update report coming to the next Cabinet meeting, of course. Decisions, as I said to Cabinet when I introduced my part of the report back in a few weeks ago, decisions were taken based on their knowledge at that time. And so I just asked members to countenance that. Obviously, there's a lot of water has flown under the bridge since the 20th of April. Perhaps I could just draw attention to Appendix 1 of the main report, which I think is page 65 of the papers that are there. By the time you scroll through to it, you may not have missed it. But during the COVID crisis, we set out a strategic approach to that. That was that Dorset Council will work to maintain critical services, sustain care, support the vulnerable and support our economy. And we also set out some principles for decision making to support our communities and businesses to respond positively to public health and government messages. Secondly, to keep our employees safe and well. And finally, to support the changing culture for Dorset Council post the crisis. And I have been focused on using that strategic framework as we've sought to make decisions. And finally, members, I just remind you that this is still a declared major incident. It's why not all of the senior leadership team are here today at the request of the chair, because actually we and our employees continue to be serving Dorset residents at this time, and you'll be aware from just the actions over the weekend how busy some of those teams have been. And as the chair has said, Councillor Mike Parks and colleagues in the Fire and Rescue Service and police and our emergency planning teams working with the various fires over the last few weeks. It is a serious endeavour, but I look forward to listening to and hearing questions from members and being able to respond to those.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Should we get it straight into the body of the business? So I will go to our first member, and we're going alphabetically by surname. Councillor Andy Canning, would you like to start asking any questions you may have for the panelists?
Yes, thank you. Broadly speaking, I just want to start off by saying I think that everyone involved with this has done a fantastic job over the last few months. It's been incredibly difficult circumstances for the whole of our community and for all of our staff and for all the organisations we work with as well. And I think by and large, they pretty much have done an excellent job of coping with the difficulties and the strains of the situation. So by all means, accept that any questioning I've got is very much from a sort of point of view of being a friendly questioner rather than being hostile in any fashion. because certainly I don't think we have anything to be particularly upset about. Broadly speaking, I think the work that the council's done has been good and positive. Altogether, I've got lots of questions I'd like to focus on, if I may. Firstly, if we go to page 19 of the whole report, point 9.8, which is to do with mentioning, which mentions about teams and technology and stuff like that. And I want you to use that as a sort of a hanging point to peg a series of questions about whether our response was fast enough from a democratic point of view, from an internal management point of view. While we did very well in responding quickly to the public, and I accept that they have the highest priority, have we been as fast as we could have been in getting democracy to operate during this situation, or has actually the fact that there's not been a review or scrutiny committee meeting for several months something we should be more concerned about? It does seem at times that the reasons why we haven't had meetings seem to have changed, or the reasons given to members have changed. Sometimes it's talk about the problems with technology. Sometimes it's talk about the problems of redirecting staff. What I'd like to do, therefore, is ask really whether, for an overall view of whether officers feel that we have been fast enough in actually dealing with the technology challenges and the challenges to actually keep the democratic organisation functioning as a council. And in fact, we've actually been quite slow compared to some other councils adopting and changing our working practices to adapt with technology. I mean, for those of you who are on some town councils, for example, I'm a member of the Dorset Town Council, and we've had 2 months of meetings online prior to this meeting, for example. So we moved much faster to adopt new technology and to get meetings going and people working from home and that sort of thing. And I just wanted to ask for some comments really on how you think it went for this council, and whether there was anything more we could have done to be faster in responding.
Chair, it's Aidan Dunn here, Executive Director of Corporate Development. Shall I start by way of response?
If you feel that's the most appropriate.
Yeah, if I start, and colleagues may wish to join. So part of my responsibilities is the oversight of the ICT services supporting this organisation, and the issue of our digital response was something that the Executive Advisory Panel, which met last week for digital and ICT, the EAP for digital and ICT, started looking at that last week. I think from a technological response point of view, our priority was to ensure that the organisation continued to work and continue to operate. And overnight, we were able to get 2,500 staff working from home once the lockdown came. In order to do that, we had to build a whole load of laptops and issue out equipment. And I think that was a great success. The fact that we barely missed a beat in that sense in terms of getting and keeping the organisation operating. Secondly, I think the use of the technology we've become increasingly proficient at, as the very fact that we're meeting now as a scrutiny committee, but a month or so ago we met as cabinet. The audit committee has met virtually. We've used the technology to great effect for Cabinet to keep members informed. There have been 9 member seminars where all members have been able to get involved. And indeed, later this week, as an organisation, we're going to be briefing over 4,000 staff through an all-staff briefing, even though we continue to work remotely. So in terms of the technological response, I think we've done reasonably well. At the EAP last week, we looked at other organisations. Some have responded quicker, and as Councillor Canning mentions, some have responded quicker, but we're also aware that others haven't responded as quickly as ours. Some of them haven't had a cabinet meeting at all. So I think from a technological point of view, we're learning, we're continuing to learn, and indeed we need to keep getting better and better, because I suspect that we're going to have to continue to meet virtually for quite some time. So from a technological response, that's my perspective.
Jonathan Mayer.
Good morning, Chairman. Jonathan Mayer, Corporate Director, Legal and Democratic. I think there is an important point here as well about scale and complexity. I was speaking to one of the town clerks. She has a staff of 6, and as Aidan has said, we've needed to move an entire workforce, a number of thousands of people, over onto working online. In addition to that, there are other service pressures that have been in place. For instance, the need to put in place digital courtrooms to enable the judges to continue to hear child protection hearings. So I think it would be wrong to look in isolation and say we haven't moved quickly enough to re-establish local democracy when there have been a whole series of other service pressures that have needed to compete for priority for time from colleagues in Aidan's services. Thank you.
Councillor Jill Haynes.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I just wanted to raise the issue that there are so many different varieties of virtual meeting that sometimes it makes it really difficult for us to speak to other organisations. So the CCG have a different system, BCP, Bournemouth, Poole and Christchurch Council, a different system, and many of our parishes are actually using Zoom, which we're told we're not supposed to get involved with. So I think moving forward, it's something that we actually need to address so that we can arrange appropriate meetings with those other organisations. Thank you.
Councillor Andy Canning, can I pass back for you for any further questions you may have?
Yeah, I think it's an important point that Aidan raises there. We may well be in these meetings for quite some time to come. So the important thing is that we're getting it set up and getting it right for the future. And I am broadly happy with the way things are going in terms of getting more regular meetings happening and more questions taking part. So I think that have answered the points. I think in an ideal world, we would want our democracy to have carried on a bit more, responded perhaps a bit faster. But I do accept the point that there's a huge amount of pressure to get the whole staff situation sorted and get the services that are connected with the public sorted first. So I think that I do accept that, certainly. If I move on to question 2, if that's all right.
Certainly.
Okay. This is on page 27 of our report, item 10.8. There's a list of subgroups that appear there, which are areas of priority for the council and for the work that we're doing. I just had a question. Really, was how are those groups chosen in the first place? I'm a bit surprised that the obvious one seems to be missing to me, which is the work of volunteers or coordinating volunteers or something like that. Maybe they come in a different work stream or a different area or whatever. But I was surprised that wasn't there as part of the priorities. I don't know if anyone wants to comment on that, or how that group, how that list there got to be created in the first place.
Chairman, it's Aidan Dunn again, if I could respond.
Of course.
Okay, yeah. Page 27, paragraph 10.8, that's a list of the LRF subgroups. That's the Local Resilience Forum. So these are the Dorset-wide subgroups that form part of the overall emergency response of Dorset. So for the majority of the response period, I've been on Gold Command, so been part of the strategic coordination group, which has had oversight of each of these issues. So as a coordination group, we've established those as issues arose. There's separately within this report is a list of the internal Dorset Council response groups. We call those cells. So, for example, we've got a commercial cell, and within so on the point on volunteering. Within the LRF, that we have got a volunteer lead coordinator, but also within Dorset Council, volunteering is coordinated through the SHIELD process. And if you need further detail, I think Teresa Levy would be able to respond to that.
Okay, but how was this list drawn up in the first place? How do we decide what were going to be the working priorities?
In terms of 10.8, the paragraph 10.8, yeah. So that's that as the situation evolved. I mean, there's a fairly standard, if there's an emergency response, these are the issues that you need to deal with. But as the emergency evolved, we set up various groups as demand required. So if you take, for example, ports and borders, there was an issue very early on in the response where, for example, the cruise ships we knew that cruise ships were going to be an issue as they approached Portland. So we set up a group looking at ports and borders. So it was demand driven as the issues emerged.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Right, thank you. I think I'll go on to my third question then. On page 28, 11.4, which is to do with coordination of members. And I want to say, I think the weekly webinars that have taken place have been really excellent and have certainly worked very well to keep members informed of what's going on. I think if I've heard one criticism, it's basically that about the coordination of volunteers and what the council's doing. So sometimes it's very hard for local members who might be involved in groups in their communities trying to provide aid and support for individuals or groups within their local communities, haven't always been able to find out what's going on from the bigger picture point of view, and have sometimes found themselves in a position where they're duplicating the work of other streams of organisations. So they'll turn up with some food or to communicate with somebody and find that somebody from another organisation has already been to see that person, has already dealt with the queries involved. Sometimes so we've got an issue of duplication going on. Other times it's a question of people falling through the cracks and not being supported at all. And I just wonder if there's any consideration about how members could be more involved in their local communities, or at least more aware of what other organisations are doing in their local communities. Because I think the Pan Dorset side of things worked quite well, but I have a question really about whether the local knowledge was there, or the members were involved enough locally so that they knew what voluntary organisations, what the council was doing in their particular wards.
Theresa Levy, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Councillor, for your question. Absolutely, I think we want to look and ensure as we go forward that we're increasingly engaging with everybody that we can to deliver the shielding response in particular. And I think that, picking up on your previous point and this one, we are really keen to work with members on how best we can share information. And without labouring the GDPR point of view, I have on 3 occasions formally inquired again of MHCLG around data sharing, and the message remains the same. And in fact, just for assurance of members, we don't share with anybody the entire list of the 16,000 plus Dorset residents who are shielding, and we don't have permission to share that total list with anybody. But what we do share through the PISA, the information sharing arrangements that we have in place with Age UK and Volunteer Bureau Dorset, is we share those people who have consented to have their information shared. And I know that you'll all appreciate the complexity of that. And many people who are on the shielded list are obviously on there for intensely personal reasons. Some people, in fact, in quite large numbers, people have said to us, thanks ever so much, but we don't want any further contact. Please remove us from your checklist. Now, that doesn't mean that they can, by the nature of that, be removed from the shielding list, and that's another much more complex point. But we are keen to bring more people into that arrangement as we go. What we've done so far is asked people to register with our system online, and people have done that, in lots and lots of organisations have done that. And the initially 3 times a week call, the planning calls around shielded, had people from all sorts of organisations, including the churches and other volunteer bureaus. So we are incredibly grateful and really struck by the amount of support. And you're right, in some places I think that support has certainly crossed over with national provision, and we haven't, I think it's fair to say, always been totally comfortable or impressed by the way in which the national delivery of food and data has been undertaken. And we've been having now twice weekly contact with the national body around making that better. And increasingly, that's now coming down to a local level, because I think it has been a concern for people that sometimes national food packages, for example, have been coming at a time when people have no longer wanted them. Big challenge for our community and for ourselves was around access and suitable access to supermarket slots. Actually, that was the biggest challenge, and until people could get assured of that, they were really struggling to move on. So we want to look forward as we think that whilst some freedoms and flexibilities have been offered to people who are shielding, they are minor, and we are expecting that they will remain within some degree of shielding probably till the end of the year. And so we want to work ever more to look at the mechanism to make sure that all of our support and voluntary groups are plugged into the system that we have in place. But I think it's fair to say that the comms team have been really fast off the pace in getting that all up to date on the websites since the very beginning, and updating that as we go. So I think the information's there, but I appreciate this, and I know you will appreciate, at pace and at space, and the shielded population are across all of our county. It has been at times a challenge to make sure that everything is completely knitted together.
Thank you.
Councillor Parks.
Yeah, thanks, Chairman. I just want to really add a supplementary to that, and I appreciate that Teresa's probably covered some of it in what she said, but it's really just an observation. Accepting GDPR and the issues around the sensitivity of personal information. Certainly as a ward councillor, and I know fellow colleagues elsewhere have experienced this, there are some very, very vulnerable people within our wards that are not getting help because as ward councillors, we can't identify who those people are. Now, some of these people have, and I believe purely by chance, been picked up by the local Corona support group volunteers. But you know, moving forward, there must be some sort of way we can get round this rather than hiding behind you know, GDPR, and how as ward councillors we can actually support those people that really need our help.
Can I respond, Chair?
Yes, please.
Thank you. Yeah, so absolutely. I think that there are two things in question here, which I just think is a really important distinction that we need to understand to make sure that we get it right going forward. There are those people who are formally shielded, 16,000 people across Dorset, but actually you're absolutely right. As ward councillors, you'll be very aware of other people who are vulnerable who are not shielded. And we won't know of them necessarily. You may well know of them better than we do. And even on the 16,000 shielded list, many of those residents weren't previously in receipt of services, adult services or children's services. They weren't people who would normally have crossed our path. And so this is additional work for us as a council, and we're very happy to be delivering it. But absolutely, there will still be other people who are on neither of those radars, and it's around how we coordinate and corral that work. I would just say nothing would be easier for me than to share all the data, not hiding behind GDPR, really just trying to keep the council safe in abiding by that legislation, which we've have had strongly reinforced to us. And I think, you know, if we all put ourselves in the position of having our medical history kind of made more than public than we consent to, I think we all understand that. So we're really pushing at that as best we can. But we are looking at having some trials around how we support you in identifying your more vulnerable residents who are not necessarily on the shielded list. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Andy Canning, do you have any questions you wish to ask?
No, I think those are my three questions that I wanted to ask mostly, and I think they've all been very well answered. Thank you very much for that, for all colleagues for that. While I'm on the air, so to speak, I'd also like to make a thank you to Spencer for the 2 letters that he's written in the last 24 hours and that he's circulated to all members. I think they're really good, positive letters, and certainly completely behind them on that sort of things. But yeah, those are my 3 questions. So over to the next person, I guess.
Thank you very much. Then I'll pass over to Councillor Beryl Ezard.
Thank you, Chairman. I haven't got any specific questions except that as Andy has mentioned, and other people like Mike Parks has mentioned, that early on, actually, I found I was almost on my own in actually volunteering in my Wareham area. And clerks and doctor surgeries and actually the pharmacies were ringing me up saying, have you got any volunteers that can help? And have you got, you know, people that can collect, you know, things and do shopping and all the sort of basic things. And when I tried to get hold of the NHS volunteer group and talk to DCA, which we were volunteering with our group, through their helping and kindness, nothing was set up then. They said, oh, well, we're training, we're checking people, we're doing this and that. And it took 3 weeks actually of that time for them to come online. But when they came online, I was so relieved. I mean, I'm in a vulnerable group myself, being that, you know, I'm 75, that I was sort of holding fort while all this was going on. I was lucky that I was local and lots of people knew me, so I could actually, you know, bat things away and give them to other people. And certainly after Easter, after 3 weeks, we were able to use a lot of the NHS volunteer force, you know, the responders, and which I've actually now, I'm supervising quite a lot of them with other people, because a lot of people come to me and say, you know, I volunteered and I'm not being used. I don't know who to contact for that. And I said, well, if it's the NHS, you have to go back to the NHS. But certainly DCA have been marvellous and actually giving lots of information. But like a lot of the other councillors, we've been a little bit miffed and stymied by the fact that we don't know who our shielding and vulnerable people are in our area. And I've been amazed at people that have been missed out, or people that rung me up and be very distressed about why aren't I on the list and all of that. And I've actually had to say to them, ring up the NHS, you know, with this line, or ring up your GP and ask, because I had no other contact to do until obviously your line came on, that you know, the Dorset County Council one saying ring up this number, and that was absolutely a big relief. But it did seem to be a long time coming, but we managed in the end, and I was very relieved that through all this, I did ask the DCA if they had any PPE, and they said no. And also I didn't actually get our ID badges for about 4 weeks. So it's quite tricky, because we had to go around with our only, you know, our member badges, Dorset Council badges, to say who we were and what we were doing. And that made us quite feel very vulnerable. But luckily we got hold of our own PPE. In fact, I was so thankful to Ryan Holloway, who had a whole cache of this for his business. Otherwise, I would have been really it would have been really difficult for us to help these people. But that's all I wanted to say. Now things are absolutely tickety-boo, and really we got more volunteers than we can actually get work for. But I did, you know, I know it was a very difficult start, but it did put people like me in a very awkward position to try and get other people to kind of volunteer when they said, well, you know, we're not on the list, we haven't actually volunteered yet, and I'm trying to get other councillors to give me a hand. So, you know, just to flag that up in this case. But anyway, apart from that, I think that, you know, the council have done a wonderful job, and I think that it is very, very important that we actually do thank everybody for all the work they put in. And I've had local people here that have really signed up and been marvellous. So, you know, all I can say is, you know, next time, if we get in a second spike, please let us know what's going on a little bit more and a bit sooner, so we've got the contacts. Thank you.
I'm going to ask if Councillor Laura Miller or Teresa Levy would like to respond to that, because obviously some of the things about PPE for volunteers in there, I think, could be fleshed out a little. Who would like to take the lead on that?
I'll just quickly, if I may, Chairman, make a few comments in response, and then I'm sure that Teresa would like to fill in a bit of the detail. I completely accept that members have felt frustrated throughout the process. I think back to the first sort of week or two when we stood up the Community Shield work, and we were meeting daily, and there was this real sense of crisis. It was a crisis. It continues to be a crisis. And I think we were trying to respond in an appropriate and timely way to the needs of the communities, whilst working with information and data from government that was, if I'm honest, not always 100% reliable and still isn't. We've pushed back on that. Member involvement, we tried very hard to get individual groups to register with our central Dorset Community Action and the Volunteer Centre, because we felt that if everybody and all groups had registered in one place, then we would try to avoid as much as we could the duplication that I think Andy, or I can't remember, sorry, somebody has just mentioned, the duplication, and, you know, turning up to people's houses to find that they've already been helped. And the aim of asking everybody to register centrally was to try to avoid that. Now, I will also accept that there'll be instances where that didn't work. It wasn't a perfect situation. I don't think we could ever have achieved a perfect situation, but I think that, I mean, personally, I've learned lessons about, you know, member involvement. And whilst we have pushed back very hard on that GDPR issue, I have personally, you know, I've been to seek clarification from MPs, from central government. I know Teresa has, and we've always received the same message. But at the same time, when I've had ward members come to me and say, look, I know this guy down the road and he's not received his letter, he's not getting priority, supermarket delivery, what do I do? We've been able to sort that out. And I take Councillor Azard's point that it might have taken a week or two to get that number up and running. And, you know, we are learning all the time. We are learning every single day. And I think I certainly will take that member involvement issue forward. At the moment, I think we've got so many members that are kind of cornerstones of their voluntary groups, and other members that are looking to join their voluntary groups. And if we can continue to try to get everybody together and registered, then we will avoid that duplication going through. We're very much working on a 3, 6, 9 months. As Teresa said earlier, this isn't a crisis response that we say, oh, well done, we did that and now it ends. We're standing this up and continue to stand it up at least till the end of the year for some groups of people. So it's important that we continually reflect and continually hear from ward members, especially, I think, and members of the public, how it's working and what we could be doing better. There are several instances really that I can think of where someone has actually come to us in our shielding meeting in the early weeks and said, hang on a minute, we need this. And our teams have been able to go, okay, we'll do that. And I think, you know, that's incredible. And the shielding teams have been incredible in their response. And we continue to learn. The PPE issue, we did stand up very quickly a PPE hub for our CQC registered settings. Volunteer PPE has always had, you know, different guidance depending on the job that you're doing. If you're doing shopping, then probably hand sanitizer was enough. And then there were, you know, it depends what you were volunteering for. And I know that there are some comments about PPE for some of our service providers who were going around to people's houses in exceptional circumstances to do personal care, and I'll comment on that a bit later. Teresa, I don't know if you want to sort of flesh any of that out a bit. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Laura. Absolutely. So just yeah, to really just reinforce what Laura's saying and to clarify a couple of matters around the particular guidance. So those shielded letters started coming through on the 22nd of March. We had on that day set up our first Community Shield meeting, and actually by the 29th of March we had a wide spectrum of partners across Dorset engaged in, as Laura says, daily meetings, including the fire service, including voluntary services, churches, a range of colleagues across the partnership, and really working at pace to get that happening. And at the same time, of course, closing day centres for older people and then converting those day centres into spokes for our hub, to be able to make sure that we've got a good deployment across the whole of the county where we need provision to be at pace. And that delivery of that provision happening from highway staff who suddenly were converted from doing their ordinary day job into being the deliverers of packages for vulnerable people. And supporting a principle and a commitment that was made right back then on the 22nd of March, which said actually this must be personalised. We discovered very quickly with the national deployment of food parcels that it really wasn't what people needed. You know, if you are suffering and recovering, hopefully, from cancer treatment, a bag of potatoes and a box of Wheatos isn't really going to do it for you. And very quickly our residents taught us a lot, which was that actually when people are poorly, when they're ill, they do have, don't we, very particular dietary needs. And so we had some wonderful staff who work in different parts of the organisation normally, and the volunteers going off and buying those very personal requirements. So, you know, I remember one particular resident telling us that she really could only eat a particular type of soup from Marks and Spencer's. And that's what she'd been living on since her cancer treatment, and she went off and got, and that was gained for her. So that level of personalisation, going from that really significant, complex, strategic delivery down into making sure that we kept it personal, has remained our challenge. And we know that outside of those shielding lists, there are people who haven't had their letters. We weren't responsible, I know you know this, for delivering those letters. Those came from the primary care networks. It was for GPs to identify who they thought were clinically vulnerable. And those went straight into central government. And it was when that data came out of central government, having gone through a Serco process, that we were then able to make contact with people. So that was kind of a delay for us that was really frustrating, I have to declare. But we are now in a smoother process around that, as more of that is coming to us generally locally, and that will allow us to engage more with members. PPE, the guidance has been clear. And that's both been for our staff and for volunteers who are not delivering direct care, that they should not and would not require masks and anything other than simply hand washing. That has been a determination from central government to make sure that those people who are delivering clinical interventions have enough access to PPE. That hasn't been an easy message to balance through, and I appreciate people's concern around that, but we have needed, as with all things in this crisis, to follow the public health guidance. Thank you.
Councillor Jane Somper.
Thank you, Chairman. I've got a question around the volunteer centre and the location of volunteers. I have volunteered myself to do various things and was surprised that when the household recycling centres opened and there was a call for stewards, which I volunteered for, my services weren't called. That's good. But when I went myself, I was surprised to meet a volunteer who'd come from Swindon, who had taken over a shift from someone who'd come from Trowbridge. Bearing in mind I live about 3.5 miles from Shaftesbury, I just wonder how that sort of thing came about, and is that common across the various volunteer groups?
I'm happy to attempt to respond to this, although the HRC volunteering is different to the shielding volunteering. So my understanding, and there may be other officer colleagues online who can give a different, more detailed response to that. The volunteer centre for Dorset around shielding has been pulling volunteers from Dorset. They haven't been able to access, as I think Beryl, you were describing earlier, quick enough access to the NHS volunteer bank. We weren't able to gather assurance around the ordinary DBS issues, etc., around that in order to be able to plug those in as quickly as we wanted to. My understanding was that the HRCs were being resourced from our skills agency, which was our own staffing working differently, but I don't know if a colleague online can give any more details to that.
Matt Prosser.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And Teresa, you just built very convenient on it. So we did set up internally a skills agency. This was for staff who were effectively, their service had been stopped because of government advice, and that's leisure centres, libraries, countryside staff, and they have been used effectively to redeploy. So what I don't know, Councillor Somper, is whether the two people you're talking to are actually employees who had volunteered to do those shifts or not, but we're happy to take that offline and we can look at that. Clearly, when we're receiving volunteers, and this has been a thread throughout it, and perhaps what a marvellous position to be in. We've had more volunteers than necessarily jobs. I mean, I know there are some councillors on here who've signed up for the Good Sam app for the NHS, and I think one of them had quoted me at the numbers of hours that they'd been on volunteering duty but had never been called upon. And whilst that's frustrating for the individuals, I think it shows what an overwhelming response we've had from our public and our communities, which we should be grateful for. But it has in turn brought its own challenges, where sometimes we see the situation exist where, Councillor Sombre, I absolutely understand. There seems to be little logic on the face of it as to why those people would have come from Trowbridge and Swindon to volunteer unless they were actually employees who we were redeploying into that service. But we're happy to have a conversation offline with Councillor Sombre about that.
Thank you. I think this might be a sensible time, because of what we've just been discussing, if Helen Whitley, our clerk, would be willing to read out Councillor Jill Taylor's pre-submitted questions. For members of the public, Councillor Taylor isn't a member of this committee, but is a member of the council and has pre-submitted a question to be asked on her behalf.
If you just bear with me a moment.
Sorry for springing that on you.
That's all right, it's fine. Hold on a moment. Okay. So Councillor Jill Taylor says, our frontline staff have continued to visit vulnerable clients in their homes during COVID. This, I believe, has included social workers who are doing routine checks on residents. Part of their checks support includes entering the client's property, as it would not be possible in some cases to ensure the ongoing safety of this client group without being able to see them in their home environment. It is my understanding that the staff who are being asked to undertake these checks support are still not being provided with the necessary PPE. If this is correct, please could you comment on why these staff members were not including staff requiring PPE to undertake their day-to-day work for their own safety and for the safety of the clients they are visiting? Do you want me to stop there, or do you want me to ask the next question as well?
I think the next question is very highly linked. Okay. Shall we ask that as well?
Okay. So Councillor Taylor's next question was about the risk assessments for staff visiting clients. When they were in place taking COVID into account, how they were amended and how that information was disseminated to staff.
Councillor Laura Miller.
Thank you, Chairman. Yep, I'm happy to respond to both of those together. So visiting our vulnerable clients is my exception rather than the norm. And on the 18th of March, the locality managers sent out a PowerPoint to all of their staff advising them that staff must call the vulnerable individual first to check if they've any symptoms or if anyone in their household has had symptoms. If any of our staff have had symptoms, they were asked to self-isolate for 7 days and 14 days if family member had symptoms as per the guidance. Staff were also asked to call the area practice manager to talk through with them alternatives to visiting in person. So maybe is there another professional visiting who's got to go, like a district nurse, who could undertake the visit or assessment, or can it be done remotely or via a carer or relative? If that wasn't possible, we have always provided PPE for any member of staff who's had to do a physical visit, and when the localities have not themselves had PPE, they've obtained stocks via the hospitals or the community rehab team. It's important to state that no member of staff has ever been asked to do a physical visit without appropriate PPE, and this links back into Teresa's message about the guidance. The locality groups have had managers have had a stock of PPE, so any member of staff that needs to do a visit can pick it up, have it delivered, and the staff member and anyone who needs to do more regular visits have been given a stock to keep in their car. It's important to say the exceptional cases that I referred to, where a member of staff has had to visit the person physically, have been where they've got perhaps fluctuating mental capacity to make decisions, or possible complete lack of capacity, or where there's been a safeguarding issue. So I hope that's reassuring, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you for that response. When Councillor Jill Taylor sent Helen and I that question, she said that a member of staff had confidentially raised this with her. I was wondering if yourself and possibly Matt Prosser would be willing to reach out to Jill and see if this individual through her would be willing to work with you to make sure that this is an isolated case and is not the norm. Obviously, if that member of staff feels happy to do so, and obviously when you do so, could you please copy me in to make sure that has been done?
Yeah, absolutely, Chairman. Where there are individual cases, we've done this all the way through. If there are individual cases and concerns, it may be that the messaging hasn't got through, or that there's been a break in the links and chain. I'm always happy to take it up and always happy to respond. And of course, I'll copy you in. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to move on now to Councillor Barry Gorringe for any questions he may have.
Thank you, Chairman.
Councillor, you're currently muted. If you could please unmute yourself.
Hello, can you hear me?
There we go.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Oh, good. Thank you. Yes, I have 3 or 4 different questions. But firstly, I'll just start off and say that, generally speaking, I thought that Dorset Council, the staff and management, carried out a very good job in responding so quickly to this pandemic back on the 20th of March. So I don't have any particular questions in regard to that, but some of the issues that have already been brought up, like, for instance, the shielding, for instance, the road that I live in, there's 10 properties in this road, and 3 of the properties have elderly people in their 80s and 90s who are vulnerable, and none of those people seem to be on the shielding list. So my wife and I have actually been looking after these people and doing their weekly shopping and going to the chemist and picking up their prescriptions, etc. So that is a point. I know it's already been raised, but I just thought I'd mention that. The other thing that I thought I'd just mention about is Dorset Council took over these 2 hotels, the one in Weymouth and Sherborne, and it probably, in hindsight, I'm not sure if that was probably necessary, because they seem to be underused. In my opinion, and this is probably something that Dorset Council is not in their area, but some of these cottage hospitals, and there's one in St Leonard's, should have been opened up and taken the overflow from the hospitals. So that's.
Can I ask Councillor Laura Miller to respond to that, please?
Yes, of course. Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Councillor Gorringe, for that question. The issue of using the hotels as care facilities has always been a tricky one. I am very, very grateful that they weren't needed to their capacity. That's a good thing. Of course, if we had not stood them up, we might have needed them. It's important not to conflate the 2 issues of cottage hospitals and their uses, community hospitals and their uses, especially the closed ones, because they are under NHS control. We don't have access to those. And what we were looking for was not a hospital facility. We were looking for care facilities because of the significant pressure that our social care sector was and continues to be under. We have experienced sort of staffing pressures, flow pressures in the push to make sure that as many people could be discharged from hospital as possible. They were not always able to go home, and what we wanted to do was to increase the capacity in the care market so that we could field those people and they could receive occupational therapy support and things like that. The community hospitals, the cottage hospitals, if they've been closed for some time, the amount of time taken to actually reopen them, electrical testing, deep cleaning, putting furniture back, putting furnishings back, staffing them, would simply not have been practical, even if we had access, but they are NHS property and we don't. So we took that decision, as previous speakers have said, we took that decision in that moment of crisis where we had limited capacity, and a lot of acute pressure on our care sector to extend our care provision by the use of hotels. It's also important to say that we wanted to have live-in care staff, and that wouldn't have been possible in the hospitals, even if we had had access to them. So in summary, really, we couldn't have used the hospitals, we didn't have access to them, it wouldn't have been suitable even if we did, and I'm glad that the capacity in the hotels wasn't needed, because I think it speaks highly of the work that's happened in our social care sector and in our acutes to keep our numbers right down. If anybody else wants to add anything or comment, I've presented to Cabinet on this and also in member seminars, webinars. So, you know, I have figures and information about this that I'm very happy to take up with Councillor Orange afterwards if you're not sort of sufficiently reassured by my response. Thank you, Chair.
I'm going to jump in quickly here because one of the pre-submitted questions from a non-committee member in the council, Councillor John Orrell, raises this exact issue. And what I have agreed with Councillor Jill Haynes, who is the chair of the ONS for Health, is that she is working with our counterparts in Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole Council and with the CCG to put together a scrutiny meeting with them, which probably would be a more appropriate forum to raise these questions. And she is going to raise those on Councillor Orrell's and I hope you don't mind, your behalf. And I'll ask that when that meeting does come, that you're made aware of it. So actually, someone who may be more educated on the matter will be able to respond, if that's okay, Councillor.
Yes, thank you very much for that response. I do have a couple of other questions, not related to the report, but it's something that has happened in the last week or two. May I ask those questions?
Yes, as long as they are related to Dorset Council's response to COVID-19.
Right. Okay. It's things that have happened in the national news that we've seen in the last few days. Basically, I was going to ask a question with regard to which has really been answered by Spencer in his letter to Robert Jenkins, the MP and Minister of Housing and Communities, that in the event that we don't get any further grants from government over and above the 21.1 million already received, we do still have the 28 million in reserves, I believe, which will probably get used during June and July and probably August. That leaves us in a very vulnerable situation. Then, do we think that we'll get any more grants from central government?
Who would like to respond?
Chairman, it's Aidan Dunn, Executive Director, Corporate Development and Section 151 Officer. So I can give a quick financial perspective to that question. And thank you for those that haven't seen the letter the leader wrote to the Department of Communities and Local Government. It just laid out the financial position of Dorset Council, as Councillor Orange has just described. Our estimate is that the response to COVID is costing us potentially up to £60 million, depending on how long the crisis goes on for. So far, government has provided us with £21 million, and as the crisis goes on, we're having to start to eat into, and if I could use the phrase, burn through our reserves, and our reserves are limited. We can only spend them once, so it is of real concern to us. We're not alone. Every council in the country is in a similar position, and the department, MHCLG, has been gathering data on a monthly basis to understand the situation, but there is no money that has been promised, and what our leader, Councillor Flower, has laid out very clearly in his letter is that the MHCLG was very clear we should do what it takes to respond to COVID, and what we're asking them in that letter is to honour what they promised us. So we're incurring costs and we're asking for clear reimbursement. So we're continuing to put pressure on through matters such as that letter, and indeed our weekly meetings with the local MPs are putting the emphasis on making sure that we are financially sustainable. So no promises yet from government, but we're not alone in this situation. It's something that the entire local government sector is pressing hard to make sure that MHCLG and the Treasury is well aware of the situation, and indeed the dire consequences if we do not get sufficient funding. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for that response. I think if I may, Chair, I'll leave it at that. I'd just like to say to you that I reserve the right to come back before the meeting ends if I have any further questions.
Okay, please jump in if it's appropriate. I'm going to pass over to Councillor Brian Heathley next, please.
Thank you, Chair. Brian Heatley, Councillor for Rodwell and Wyke in Weymouth. Barry has taken us into the very area I wanted to talk about too, which is the finances. If the government really does not produce anything, what actually happens, and when will we see a crisis? I find the prospect of that rather improbable, given that practically the whole system of local government is in that position. But funny things could happen, or indeed one could imagine them saying we'll have a supplementary rate or something else that we really don't like at all. So I'd like to hear some idea of the contingencies that we might face. A couple of other things. I mean, if I was in the Treasury looking at this, I'd look at what the councils did, and I might be inclined to say, well, there's stuff we will pay for and stuff we won't pay for. So things that councils did that the government didn't necessarily ask them to do, for example, suspending car parking charges, well, they can pay for that. Maybe strictly the things we did ask them to do, like the extra 10% for the care homes, yes, we will look at that. I mean, I would just like to get a little bit more speculation in detail of how this might turn out and what the rules might be and so on. Final point on it, I hope we're keeping good records of how we're spending this money, not just the additional extra expenditures that are quite identifiable, but also how much of our staff effort in particular is being diverted to COVID. So, for example, I know that the library staff are now running the telephones on the inquiry system. It would be nice to know that that is an amount of resource that has been diverted from normal council business to to the COVID response, and I hope we'll be able to identify how big that is.
Matt Prosser.
Thank you, Chair. Just if I could comment on it, I think it would be inappropriate to simply speculate about these things, particularly in a live committee. And there's clearly work that needs to do. And Aidan has commented on some of this, and I know he will tell you and give assurance that we are absolutely tracking all of the expenditure that we are incurring in response to COVID-19. We're also tracking all of the income sources that we will have lost. And Councillor Heatley has quite rightly highlighted some of the areas where I'm sure there will be a detailed discussion with MHCLG officials, Treasury officials, and also via our MPs, because obviously this is not just a financial position, there's a political imperative around that. There is a significant amount of money being expended nationwide to support businesses, communities, residents and individuals. In one sense, we've never had so much money, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that money is supporting local government. It's supporting residents directly, it's supporting businesses, and we are the passporters of that. We will continue to lobby, we will continue to record, and we will continue to ensure that our MPs have the very best data and details so that they can advocate on our behalf. And as you've already seen this week, letters directly to Robert Jenrick, who is the Secretary of State for the Ministries of Housing, Communities and Local Government, and if necessary, we also are writing to Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor of the Exchequer. Clearly, the Council will need to put in place plans at appropriate points in order to react to this, and we will do that going forward. But at this stage, we are continuing, as Aidan has said, along with other councils across the country, to lobby government for their response to that, and we await that response before we move further.
Councillor Brian Heatley.
Yeah, can I just come back on comments on a couple of other points on things that have arisen. First of all, as an old bureaucrat, I really admire the response of the council, and I entirely understand why there has had to be a delegation of authority and some suspension of our normal democratic procedures and so on and so forth. I take a slightly different view from some of my other opposition colleagues. I continue to deplore the actual system that we have of a leader and cabinet system, which seems to me means we have lots of meetings, but meetings which don't have a lot of power. But I don't think that there is anything in the response to the emergency that particularly worries me. Secondly, I'm really glad to hear that we're proposing to put a whole chunk of this to the health scrutiny system. I mean, the sort of things that my colleague John Arrell has been worried about are things that involve many partners, particularly NHS partners. And I must admit, one of my questions to begin with was why this committee for this? It seemed to me the health scrutiny system is more appropriate for great chunks of it. Thanks.
Thank you. I will pass over to Councillor Sherry Jesperson next.
Thank you, Chair. I have some comments and questions, if I could, to move us into a slightly different area. First of all, thank you for those previous comments on the finances. I was going to ask about that, and I'm satisfied with those answers. I'd like to raise some points about our communication and engagement throughout this crisis. And the first thing I have to say is I think that Dorset Council's comms response to this crisis has been truly excellent. I think that we responded quickly and we've responded well, and I think the staff in the comms team can be very, very proud indeed of what they've achieved. We need, as a council, to recognise, I think, that now and in the foreseeable future, the nature of the comms challenge has changed fundamentally. Not just in, for example, the fact that the digital shift that was part of our plan already is now accelerated much faster than we had originally foreseen, and it's become a digital dash, as it were. Also, I think the nature of the messaging that we're involved in has changed. We're no longer just concerned with reporting what we've done, how we've spent your money, how we've drawn up the budget, that sort of thing, reporting and accountability. Now the messaging is much more urgent, it's much more push, it's much more about getting messages out to people on which their lives might depend. That again is quite new for a council. I think it's probably fair to say that our priority target groups has shifted. The same people are on that list, but say, for example, local businesses might now be much higher up our target group. They're higher up the list than they were heretofore, and that's likely to remain the case for the next 12 months. So in the context of this, what we are starting to think of as the new world order, as it were, I think that our comms strategy now needs a complete wholesale overview. I know that there was a comms strategy put in place by the shadow executive. I was part of that piece of work, but that was a while ago for another time and another place. And I do think, as a matter of urgency, we probably need a new communication strategy for the council, and there's a body of work that has to be done on that. And I would say again, it is reasonably urgent. I know there is a great tendency to focus on frontline services. It's no secret, colleagues who know me will know that for me, comms is a frontline service. There's nothing that's more important than that. So I would like to hear whether or not we're planning to do that, and I think we should be. The second action that I think we need to take, and this will be wrapped up in the first, is we need to evaluate some of the comms actions that we've taken since March. Evaluating comms actions, especially retrospectively, is really quite a difficult thing to do. I know that. But if we don't evaluate what we've done, we won't know how to, which of it worked and which we should carry on doing going forward. Just to give a very small example, the postcard that we sent out, which was exactly right. It was 100% right that we needed to put something in the post to people. The timing was good. It was just in the nick of time. I would have expected to see a second postcard come out about a month later. No postcard came, of course, and I'm guessing that that's because we were not able to evaluate the impact of that postcard. We had no data on which to decide whether or not it needed to do a second one, and there's absolutely no criticism at all implied in that, because we weren't in the position to evaluate anything. We were all in a rush, but that's why. Yes,
Matt Prosser would like to make.
Thank you very much. Yes, so my questions are we going to review the strategy, and are we going to evaluate the work we've done so far?
Thank you very much indeed, Councillor. Well, you've highlighted the points about the communication strategy: physical, written to every resident, use of social media. Obviously, that's rapid, but it doesn't cover every grouping, although it is a wider grouping than I think we understand. Towns and parishes also writing out to them on a weekly basis, and also briefing the larger towns and parishes, particularly on the reopening of Dorset, and they've been incredible help to the team here. As the senior leadership team, we initially were meeting daily, and then we were meeting 3 times a week. We've just pushed that back down to twice a week from the start of June. But in that report, every time we meet, we have a social listening paper, which is understanding what are the comments that our customers are making, and that's drawn from our social media and also from our customer call centres. So we are doing that. I know that Jen Lewis, our head of communications, is constantly evaluating what we do, but I'll be talking to her after this meeting about how we can look at the making sure that the plan is still robust and relevant for going forwards as this has changed the ways that we're talking to our communities. Happy to take further questions.
Councillor Darrell Turner.
Thank you, Chair. It's just a follow-up really on what Sherry was talking about and the response for the CEO. We have had a continuous and quite remarkable communications using electronic means, and we've got to remember that a large proportion of Dorset residents are not online. And again, I would like to see a greater effort in communicate with those non-online. And like Sherry, I believe we should have at least have one more drop, hard copy drop, to residents by now. I think the last time I spoke to one of our IT team, there's something like 30% of Dorset residents logged online. It's a huge number, and we need to react to that. Thank you.
Chairman, happy to comment.
Please do.
Councillor Turner's, I think he's right. I don't know the exact stat of this week, but it certainly was going into this pandemic around about 30% of our residents who are not online. And clearly, many of those are in those vulnerable groups who we've contacted via other means, via volunteer groups, via telephone calls. And I think one of the great successes of this has been our ability to deploy colleagues from across a range of services to speak to our communities. And if you've looked at the Feel Good Friday reports that I send out, and you'll see some of the comments that are coming back in. Those calls taking somewhere between 30 and 40 minutes as we seek to talk to our residents. So it isn't just about sending out the postcard, it is about talking to our residents. But I'm more than happy to talk to the head of comms around the ability for us to write again to every household. Clearly there's a cost associated with that, but I think it's important that we make sure we're getting our messages across and making sure we continue to care and support them.
Okay, back to Councillor Sherry Jesperson.
Yes, just to follow up the point there that Darrell made, and this is kind of what I'm talking about. When I talk about reviewing our strategy, I'm not for a moment suggesting that what we're doing isn't excellent. It is, and I've said that more than once publicly. But I think we need to understand, for example, going forward, if we're going to be communicating predominantly digitally, then there's things we need to do to drive that that have now become much more urgent than they were before. And I think we need to have a look at that. We cannot continue saying we're doing really well and it's all going very well, which it absolutely is. But for example, when people who are not receiving their information from Dorset Council digitally, when they Google to get information, they get the Dorset Echo, not Dorset Council. Now, the Dorset Echo is an excellent publication, but I would much rather that people got their information from us, not from the Dorset Echo. Now, there are things we can do in our strategy to change that, but we have to be proactive. We have to sit down and think, who are our new target audience? What is the nature of our new messaging, and what do we need to do differently than we did 6 months ago in order to make that effective? And that's what I mean when I say reviewing our strategy. It's not simply what we're doing now, it's what we're not doing that we need to do going forward. And I know it's work, but it's important.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Councillor Jesperson. I mean, one of the things obviously that we are aware of is we are tracking the increase of our digital use of services, and we are seeing those go up exponentially through that. That's changing behaviours, and that will help us in terms of how we work. If you go through to the appendix, which I referred to when I introduced it, there's some of our decision makings, our principles for decision making, where what's the culture that we want to drive within Dorset Council, our response to our communities. One of those being digital, that we enable the able, because we have many in our community who are able to access those services, but in the past have chosen not to, and are currently now are choosing to access those, which then gives us the resource to support those very vulnerable in our community who may never be able to access those services digitally. But I'll take that comment away, and I'll talk to the team about how we review that properly.
Thank you.
And it's also, I think worth noting, and Teresa Levy's just pinged me a message saying that, you know, we have distributed 1,200 laptops to vulnerable children, and obviously we are offering the digital support hour on our phone line to assist people who are trying to transition to being online for the first time, because I don't think it's fair to say that face-to-face services are feasible at this time in services which aren't completely essential. Do you have any further questions, Councillor Jesperson, before we...
No, that's me done.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
And I will pass over to Councillor David Shortall, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Chairman. I reiterate exactly what everyone has been saying. What an excellent job, I believe, that the council has done in order to fight this particular pandemic. My question really is, you know, what does the coronavirus mean for the well-being of those in later life beyond self-isolation? How are we going to look after, particularly the elder people, beyond coronavirus, and make sure that they have a well and fruitful life? Thank you.
Would anyone who would like to respond?
I can come in, Chair, if that's helpful.
Councillor Laura Miller.
Thank you. Yeah, one of the things that we're looking at is our mental health and our well-being support, and how that has changed and developed very rapidly during the COVID-19 crisis. And I think what Councillor Shortall says around helping our older, our more vulnerable residents, we're acutely aware that it's not just the physical effects, it's the effects of being locked in and not seeing family members. And of course, if you were isolated and lonely already, you may have felt that more keenly as well. So we are looking very closely at how we develop our offer to take account of the fact that we expect that there will be significant numbers of people who will come forward and say, well, actually, I didn't need your services, but now I do because of the, what's happened during lockdown. So that is something that we are very much addressing. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Chortle.
Thank you, Chairman. I've got no other questions.
Okay, and due to a minor discretion on my part, possibly me not knowing the alphabet perfectly, Councillor Howard Legg, please, next.
Thank you very much, Chair. I've got just one question. It's actually on the report as well. So the report paragraph 9.7, that's the main part of the report. The paragraph starts saying on the 12th of May. This is a decision taken by Councillor Spencer Flower about keeping beaches, destination car parks, country parks and public toilets closed. And it seems from this report that only he made that decision without any consultation with anybody. And I find that we are meant to be a democracy and we're meant to be accountable. And despite the fact that this second part of this item says largely this decision was supported by residents, yes, but there's a significant minority of people that didn't like it, particularly, for example, businesses near to some of these car parks that could have opened for takeaways but couldn't because people couldn't park nearby, partly sometimes because people were getting fined for parking on yellow lines right outside a car park, which could have been open and so they wouldn't have been fined. They could have prepaid in the car park. And then people obviously with public toilets not accessible and having a bit of a problem and having to relieve that problem in their own way. And I do mention we started off here the 12th of May. At that time, we were permitted to travel to exercise. I believe it was Gove said, when asked the question, what's reasonable to travel? He said, well, providing you're travelling less than the time it takes to exercise. So that means in Dorset, we could cross at least half of our area and still take exercise and then find out that the car park was closed maybe. So my question is, who advised or who was consulted before this decision was taken, and why weren't more councillors involved in that decision making?
Councillor Spencer Flowers.
I'll have a go at that, shall I? Yeah, I pick up on what Howard Legg's saying, but I didn't make the decision on my own. It was made after an extensive amount of consultation, particularly with town councils that had beaches and car parks and so on. It was and also the police and other agencies. It was a very well coordinated approach to the issue. The main thing I've said many times, I've said it twice today on radio interviews, I've said it in press releases, the health and well-being in the community of Dorset is really very important. And most of the businesses that you'd normally expect to see open and thriving during the holiday period are closed. And they're not going to be, they are beginning to start opening now. And he's right, there's one or two that might have opened to do takeaways, but the vast majority haven't opened. And as I said, this was all done with a lot of consultation. These sort of things have to be done quite quickly because you tend to get announcements against government guidance on the BBC. We don't get any prior notice of it, and it has to be implemented within 2 days of it being announced. Well, that you have to be fleet of foot. And as I said earlier, we've been pretty agile as a council, and I certainly, and Howard, I can reassure you, I would certainly not make decisions sitting on my own in my study. I did it with a lot of consultation beforehand. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you.
It would have been nice if the report indicated that, because it looks like it was more or less a dictator's diktat as to what was going to happen. And I'm sure it wasn't, and I accept what Spencer says, but it didn't indicate that in the report.
Can I come back, Chairman? Thank you very much, Howard. And obviously for the benefit of the public, it's been, I guess it's been minuted now in this, and this is to demonstrate to some extent what scrutiny is about, challenging and understanding the nature of issues and decisions. So actually, thank you for your question.
Thank you. Any further questions, Councillor Legg?
Finished.
Okay.
Thank you.
Then I'm going to pass over to Councillor Matt Hall, who is the chair of the Audit and Governance Committee.
Thank you, Chairman. I've got two questions. The first one is, our nation, our county, has not had to deal with such a pandemic for 100 years. So I think really we should firstly be grateful and thankful to all the council staff and all the volunteers across Dorset. But what that does mean is that 100 years ago, nobody took the time to document how they dealt with such a pandemic. So my question firstly is Dorset Council making sure that it documents what it's doing, why it's done, and the decisions which are made, so that should anything in the future happen, lessons can be learned and there is a starting point for future councils.
Chair, would you like me to respond?
Matt Prosser.
Thank you, Councillor Hall. Very good question. So it's one of the reasons I think members, you will have seen if you've gone through to some of the documentation, the timelines that we've been producing. The timeline is helping us to set out the decisions and when they were taken, because history it goes rapidly, doesn't it? And you look back and you go, really, we only been doing this for 10, 11, 12 weeks. What decisions did we take when? And the reason for my opening comment was about this report being in a period of the window up until the 20th of April, because we took decisions up until that point based on what we knew then. If we knew now, then we might have taken slightly different decisions, and I guess that's an important part. So yes, we are capturing that documentation. We have all the records of all of the decisions that we have been taking, and there's a supplementary report to that, particularly around those significant decisions. And we're also capturing that learning as we go through that process as well. I think it's really important that we do that, and this process is an important part of that.
Councillor Hall.
Yeah, my second question is, as Chairman of Audit and Governance, throughout April and throughout May, my inbox has been full of questions from across the council chamber with regards to what is perceived to be the lack of scrutiny that has been going on. We understand that COVID-19 has caused meetings to be cancelled, but in days of modern technology, Teams, etc., it does seem strange that many of these meetings were cancelled with no future dates arranged. I understand that many of the decisions which have been made and highlighted in the report are what I would class as operational, but I feel that many of those decisions and the reasons why have not been communicated to members well enough. I was interested in yesterday's statement that was released by Dorset Council with regards to the decisions that have been made during COVID, and most of the statement I found quite interesting, but the last statement concerned me somewhat. And I quote, "Once the COVID-19 major incident is over, the council will resume its usual process with key decisions made by councillors through committee." 2 points. Firstly, it seems to suggest that key decisions are being made without councillors and without committee's input, which, bearing in mind modern technology, that should not be the case. But also that phrase, major incident is over, when we consider that some experts are talking about this going on for a year, 2 years, seeing a second spike throughout the flu season in the autumn and Christmas period, what sort of time frame are we actually talking about before council committees get back to normal, please?
Councillor Spencer-Flowers, would you like to respond to that?
Kick it off. I think Matt might want to come in as well, Piers. Thank you very much. I think they're more key operational decisions, Chairman. There haven't been any policy decisions, and I think that's a very important thing, that committees, cabinet, full council, when we come to policy making and policy decisions, absolutely that's a democratic fundamental. So I would always be very much in favour of that. As far as I can recall, and Matt might want to tell me this is correct or otherwise, that the government working assumption is the 31st of July when it comes to the principal aspects of COVID being over. Now, you're right, Matt Hall, there may well be some spikes and there might be some continuing issues going forward. We don't know yet, and it's difficult to predict what that is. So I'm a little concerned about I will tell you now that from what the date we've set, the 3rd of September, we will be having our meetings back in line. Hopefully we'll be back in person. That's my ambition, and I'm sure it's one that I know because I've spoken to many colleagues. It's shared by many other members across the chamber. And we might be able to use some hybrid. It's a matter of, Jonathan might want to comment. It's a matter of government legislation. The legislation we've got in place for COVID and so on, to allow us to have virtual meetings, didn't kick in towards the end of April when we got the bill through Parliament, and then we got the regulations. And before that, councils couldn't have any virtual meetings. It wasn't allowed. We're doing that now. We're doing it quite well. But they in themselves are a challenge. So I can reassure Matt Hall that absolutely as soon as we can get back into full-blown democracy, I'm for it. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Councillor Matt Hall.
Thank you for the clarification. It's just a shame that that paragraph in that statement wasn't better phrased.
Okay. Any further questions?
Chair.
Not for me, thank you.
Chair, could I just
Matt Prosser.
Could I just add and thank Councillor Hall for that clarification, and he's right. What I think the aspiration of putting the word key in there was to enable readers outside of the council to understand that not all decisions are taken in committee. You know, we're a large organisation with over 5,000 staff, a £304 million budget. You don't run that via making operational decisions in committees. I know you all know that as elected members. And for me, the democratic process is being exercised by each one of you as members, as every time you ask a question on behalf of your communities, every time you give some support to your communities, that is a key part of the democratic process. But as Councillor Flower said, our determination to get the democratic process, not like we saw it before in normal, because we're not meeting in person at the moment, but get those meeting cycles re-going is really key. First of all, we had to wait for the legislation to come in. That was key part of the challenge. But we're committed to making that happen and make sure that that is opened up as swiftly as possible. So thank you, Matt, for the question.
Thank you. I'll pass over to Councillor Jill Haynes, who is the Chair of the Health Overview and Scrutiny.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I have no questions to put forward. I think it was a very full report that was explained very well at the Cabinet, and I think this has been a very useful commentary on it today. I would like to say something a little bit about health scrutiny. I have had members of the public and some members of the council asking why we weren't moving ahead with health scrutiny virtual meetings immediately. I have discussed this at length with our own officers and with the CCG, and did not feel it appropriate at this time to put additional pressure on all of those staff who are working so hard at the moment to come forward and produce papers for meetings. We will be holding, and I have discussed this matter with both the directors of Dorset Council and BCP. We will be holding a joint scrutiny meeting, hopefully at the beginning of July, maybe the second week of July, to look at both the CCG and the NHS response to COVID, combined with the joint working of the council across the whole of the integrated care system. So we are going to be looking at that. It does have some technical issues to sort out, because not the least of which is the CCG and BCP don't use Microsoft Teams. So it's quite complicated to get what is going to be quite a large meeting all working together. I'm very conscious that you have sent some perfectly valid questions through to that meeting, and as soon as I have a date, I will ensure that all other members are aware of it. That's all I have to say. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you for that update. Councillor James Somper.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you to all the officers. I've appreciated the communications actually that have been coming through on a regular basis, which has enabled me to disseminate information through to all the residents in my ward and the parish councils, who've also commented actually on the very good levels of communication they have been getting. So thank you for that. My questions actually have mostly been answered, so I won't linger on those, and forgive me if you answered this question just before about the scheme, the decisions that have been made, but it is now the 2nd of June, and having read the document, those decisions were made up to the 20th of April. And I wondered when we are going to get any further decisions that have been made between then, 20th of April, and now, when we might have sight of those, if there have been any. Thank you.
Matt Prosser.
Chair, thank you, and thank you, Councillor Somper. So yes, we included in with the report as a supplementary only those key decisions that have been taken up to the 20th of April, which was obviously when this original report period was there to cover. There have been further decisions. I'm taking an update report to Cabinet at the end of this month, and we will include within that those key decisions. I don't think there's anything necessarily to stop us to continue to publish them, except for wait till we gather a few together. So we'll take that away, and I'll have a chat with Jonathan Mayer about how we go forward with that.
Thank you. Any other questions, Councillor Somper?
No, not at this stage. Thank you.
Okay, no worries. Councillor Darrell Turner, Chair for Overview and Scrutiny for Place.
Thank you, Chairman. I've got a number of questions, I'm afraid. One we've already answered about the communications to non-online people. My first one is basically looking at the executive summary. During the BCP overview and scrutiny meeting, it was stated that unlike Dorset Council, BCP contacted all eligible small businesses about the available grant. The outcome of this was a 77% response compared to ours at 60%, and I just wanted to understand who made the decision not to contact our businesses and the reasons why. Thank you.
Chair, it's Aidan Dunn, if I could respond
yes,
to that
please.
one. Yeah, so the situation has moved on very significantly now, and Dorset Council has paid out over I think it's about £93 million to Dorset businesses. And of those that have applied, we pretty much have paid them all. So I think about 97% of them have paid. So the decision of who to contact them was taken in consultation with the relevant cabinet members. And the key point being is we put out significant communication, both both local media, social media, and through the business communities and all the networks we had available, as well as our own e-newsletter. And the point being was that we felt that sending written correspondence, written letters to business premises that may well be locked down would not be appropriate and not effective. So for the first 3 weeks, we did it all online in that regard, and we received many thousands of applications. And after 3 weeks, when we'd identified those that had not been in correspondence with us, we then put it in a subsequent, we did write to them using the mail. So we have contacted them all, but we wanted that first tranche to be done electronically. And I think what that goes on to show now in terms of nationally, there's a league table published, and at the moment Dorset Council has paid the 6th highest number of businesses locally in the country, so 6th highest in the country. But if I could just, if you forgive me for a second, if I could just take the opportunity to publicise the fact that we launched yesterday an additional scheme. So the original scheme that Councillor Turner referring to was for the retail scheme, it was called. We've got a discretionary scheme which we opened yesterday. Details are on our website, but the opportunity to apply for that is for only 2 weeks, and that's for businesses that haven't been able to apply for other grants. So small businesses that haven't received other grants so far. Thank you.
Thank you, Aidan. I did actually share and retweet those offers yesterday. So
brilliant. Thank you so much.
That's sorted. My second question, at 9.1, we see the total deaths in care homes stood at about 44% of all COVID-related deaths in Dorset. I'm a bit perplexed because I can't quite understand why, if residents in care homes are extremely ill, why they were not transferred to hospital where the best care and equipment was available. And I just wondered if Cabinet or SOT members could give me an understanding around this issue, really in the light of the responsibilities and duty of care to all our residents in Dorset. Thanks.
I'm just wondering at this point whether Jane Horn from Public Health Dorset might be the best person to respond, or Laura Miller has just flagged that she'd like to respond. So I'll pass over to Councillor Laura Miller to start with, and Jane, if you'd like to make comments, could you please pop it in the internal chat box? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I think it's important to say that if any person requiring hospitalisation, whether they live at home or in a care home, if they require hospitalisation, then they are hospitalised. It's really difficult to collate and quantify the care home data. I think public health are the right people to respond to this, but I just wanted to give reassurance that we have been so aware of this problem and so, you know, really trying to be on top of this issue along with our colleagues in public health. Of course, people in care homes are typically more vulnerable because that's why they're in care homes, and so that's a significant section of the population that really need to be protected. But I will pass over to Jane for perhaps more detail, but it is my understanding that if you were resident in a care home and you needed hospitalisation, then you, if that was the most appropriate course of action for treatment for you, then you were hospitalised. Jane, or back to the chair, sorry.
Hi, yes, it's Jane. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah. So I think a number of residents in care homes may well have advanced care plans. They may not wish, they may have a number of other conditions that are ongoing, and they may have had discussions with their families and with staff members that they actually do not wish to have treatment if they have particular conditions, you know, that require hospitalisation. So there will be an element of that for some patients in care homes. And I think if people are particularly elderly, if they have dementia, if they have other multiple conditions, it may not be in their best interests to admit them to a hospital environment, which is a massive change, may be quite scary for them, and is outside of their usual environment, particularly if you know, they are particularly vulnerable. So you know, there is an element of that. There is also something about not necessarily all of the deaths in care homes. Some of them are people that are suspected of COVID, but we may not confirm that they have COVID. So we only suspecting it, we don't necessarily know. So there's an element of that as well. But we are looking at all the deaths in care homes to try and understand whether it is just the COVID deaths or whether there are other deaths contributing where perhaps COVID wasn't recognised. So we are looking at that data at the moment.
Councillor Jill Haynes.
Thank you, Chairman. I really want to reiterate what Jane Horner has said. Some of these very vulnerable people will have end-of-life care plans, and to actually take them to a hospital is possibly one of the cruelest things that you could do to them, because they are so confused. It would be very distressing for many of them, and that is why their families have the care plans in place that say that they shouldn't be taken to a hospital if it becomes an end-of-life situation. I think people perhaps need to visit a few more care homes and realise just how tragic that is for somebody to be shipped to a hospital and die with nobody that they know there at all. So that's what I wanted to say on that one. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Darrell Turner.
Councillor Turner, you're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Sorry. Yeah, no, I have actually worked in care homes for considerable amounts of time, so I'm aware of those issues. It's just when you look at 44% of the deaths, when you compare those with the overall population of Dorset and the overall populations in care homes, it needs further work anyway. Let's leave it at that. My next question looks at 10.5, and it talks about the review of relevant information from the Local Resilience Forum. I think it's pretty obvious that there were large gaps in our resilience planning found as a result of the pandemic, and that's nobody to blame whatsoever. Our plans were good. It takes something like this to actually identify those gaps. But I want to be assured that we're learning lessons, and all these lessons and information is captured and fed into a revised plan. Thank you.
Chair, if I could respond, it's Aidan Dunn once again. If I could respond in my capacity as the gold lead in this response. So as I've mentioned before, my role as gold is to represent the council at the multi-agency response. And yes, we are a learning organisation, and we're learning across Dorset of how to work effectively together, and that's going well. I think just if I could reassure Councillor Turner, for example, colleagues have mentioned on this conversation this meeting this morning, a couple of times about the prospect of a second wave coming, let's put it that way. So part of our emergency planning team have taken a stock take of what's worked well, what hasn't worked so well, what would we do differently next time if a second wave were to come. I think we need to bear in mind that we're in the middle of responding to this crisis, but it is in different phases, in the sense the initial flurry of activities, we closed services down from within the council, and then it's been a stable position for a while, and now as the unlock started, that's put different challenges on the organisation, as we've just seen across the weekend, some of the challenges around Lulworth. So we continue to learn, we test and challenge each other, and after every kind of pinch point we have a debrief and learn well. So I think we are sort of prepared for a second wave if one were to come, but fingers crossed it won't.
Chairman, can I continue?
Yeah, Turner.
Yeah, thank you, Aidan. That was very reassuring. I'm glad we're noting all the learning points. The next question is at 13.26, and that's of the Cabinet report, where it talks about PPE and questions the resilience of the supply chain. Can the SLT update us on that supply chain's resilience, and where, if any, there are still gaps in the supply chain, especially to care homes?
Laura or Teresa, do you believe you'd be the best person to answer those?
Yeah, I'm happy to respond to that. Oh, sorry, Laura, unless you want to.
No, it's okay, Teresa. You've probably got more of the detail because I'm aware of what we've done so far, and I'm aware of our plans, but actually it might be helpful to get an up-to-date operational response. Okay,
Teresa Levy, please.
Thank you. I think the most important message is that we have been able to prioritise care homes alongside our hospital colleagues in making sure that the deployment of PPE has been well managed through the PPE cell that Aidan mentioned earlier, that's been set up under the gold and silver regulations. There have been some challenges, as you're all very well aware, in terms of some deliveries and some concerns around that throughout the piece, but at the present time, I believe that there's significantly enough PPE to meet the requirements, and we are able to have some assurance around that. Clearly, at the point of the peak, the burn rate, the use rate of PPE was challenging across the country, and supplies were of concern, but we're no longer in that position. And my understanding is that we now have enough provision as we require it.
Thank you. Councillor Darrell Turner.
Excellent, thank you, Chair. My final question, you'll be glad to hear, is slightly off track. It is related to the COVID response and how we have responded, and it's about our platforms for meetings such as this. And you know very well that I've talked about Teams versus Zoom for some times, and I do question our tunnel vision when it comes to Teams. The leader has spoken about being open to looking at different platforms. There was a request for member feedback, which we did, a number of us did, and we've had no feedback from that feedback. I think the report was outdated when it first came out because Zoom 5 with all the upgrades addressed most of the security issues. I haven't really had an answer to why we haven't looked at using this platform. Members are already using it, and we have to actually interface with other organisations and authorities. And I do not understand why we haven't trialled Zoom to understand the benefits.
Adrian Bunn.
Thank you. Yes, if I could respond with my role as corporate development lead. Yeah, it has been a hot topic, hasn't it? The Zoom versus Teams, and indeed any other products. I think by way of an update, the Executive Advisory Panel for Digital and ICT met last week. So that's a cross-party panel, and looked at this very topic in the context of not simply Zoom versus Teams, but in the context of, if we are going to be kind of meeting in a virtual democracy space for quite some time, then what is the best tool available to do that? Be it to be able to see each other, for the public to be able to see, but to be able to vote and to be more interactive. So that's something that the EAP has really got its teeth into. We've taken the information from the survey of members. We're looking at what other local authorities are doing. And we really want to get it right. But if I could get sort of slightly firm in my sort of accountable officer, Section 151 officer role, where we are right now in the middle of this pandemic, where we've got 2,500 people working remotely from home, we've got Teams, Microsoft Teams as a product, we've paid for it, we know it's secure. Colleagues with it across the organisation are familiar with it. The Democratic Services team are familiar with it. We're using it regularly. Colleagues have been trained up, and it works for us. Why would we need to change anything? And at this point is the big question that we've been asking ourselves. And one of the absolute anxieties that we have about Zoom is our cybersecurity experts have reviewed it and are basically saying that the Microsoft product that we have is part of the Microsoft family. We know it's absolutely secure. There are risks around having any other sort of periphery software downloaded onto our devices that could expose us to an unnecessary risk. So in a way, we're isolating with our family, with the Microsoft family, or reluctant to invite anybody else in because it could lead to a further infection. So that's not to say that that's the long-term view. As I said, the EAP is looking at it, but in terms of protecting Dorset Council at the moment, we're going to stick with Microsoft because that's the product that meets our needs. And just to emphasize this point about cybersecurity, this isn't about the risk of Zoom bombing where uninvited guests arrive. It's the fact of having a Zoom or any other product embedded in our network opens up doors and exposes us to a risk, and that's a risk that I don't think we should take at this time where we are so totally reliant on ICT.
Okay.
My final point, sorry, can I just make one more point, Chair? I'm ever so sorry, but what we're saying is we mustn't use it, we mustn't download the product onto our system and our networks, but that doesn't mean that we can't access Zoom meetings that other people invite us to. And I just really want to emphasize that point. Thank you.
Okay. Councillor Turner, do you have any additional questions?
No, just to come back on that really, please, if I could share, is just the fact that I think Zoom is used by many other authorities. It's used by the Cabinet, not our Cabinet. Centre for Public Scrutiny has been using Zoom. I don't quite understand how our IT advice is different from all those other authorities.
Can I suggest the best thing to do here would be to link up with Councillor Wharf and James, I can't remember his surname, head of IT, and have a chat with them, because although this is a important issue, I'm not sure if it's the most pressing one for us to dive into right now, if that's okay, Councillor Turner.
No, I accept that, thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to go to the last question from members from outside of this committee. Helen, would you please mind asking Carol Jones's first question only, because I believe we've covered her second question in our conversations today.
Okay, she says, I know many members will have heard, like me, from residents who have received government food boxes and they had no need of them. No matter how hard I tried, I could not remove names or change an address or anything. This type of activity really needs to be left to the local community as we know where the need is. I have wasted valuable time in arranging collections of these boxes to deliver them to the food banks. I would very much like this fed back, please.
Councillor Laura Miller, do you have any comments or would you just like to note?
Do I have any comments?
I'm sure you have many.
I have lots of comments. I'll keep it brief.
Thank you.
Councillor Jones, I agree with you. We have continually fed this back, firstly via the Local Resilience Forum and our military planners, and then via direct conversations with MHCLG. One of the problems we had was that when people deregistered from the National Food Box Scheme, then some of them also lost their priority supermarket delivery slots, even though that wasn't meant to happen. And so we've been reluctant to advise deregistering if they're still reliant on supermarket delivery. There's not a huge amount more I can say about this, apart from that I think collectively we totally agree a local response would have been much better. In partnership with our community voluntary sector organisations. I know our Southwest chief execs were keen to do this originally. We offered to do this, but sadly the government so far have decided to continue with their national scheme. Now that has provided me with a great deal of frustration. My mum was one of the people that needed the priority delivery but didn't need food boxes. So yeah, I get it. It's incredibly frustrating. It's a government decision that we have and continue to push back on. But what we have been able to do, as Teresa Levy mentioned earlier, is really to supplement those boxes where people need them rather than the supermarket delivery, and personalise. And we continue to do that.
Thank you. Councillor Mike Parks.
Thank you, Chairman. Fortunately, most of the questions I had listed for today have already been covered. But there was one thing I wanted to pick up was around waste and recycling. And I fully understand the need that we needed to close the home recycling centres based on the government guidance, and also why we had to suspend the garden waste collections. However, this has had a significant impact on fly tipping in particular, and I've certainly seen in my own ward, and I know it's evident elsewhere, an increase in fly tipping and also an increase in garden bonfires at a time when emergency services were setting priorities elsewhere. So I just think we need to be aware of the impact that closing these centres has had, and in particular the cost implication, I guess, moving forwards of picking up the issues around fly tipping. And then moving on, we've seen thankfully the reopening of home recycling centres, which I'm aware have been particularly busy in certain places, and in particular in relation to those where we perhaps border and use the services of other authorities. I'm thinking specifically about the Millams tip, which is a BCP centre, but serves certainly Ferndown and East Dorset residents, and the unprecedented traffic we've seen in the last week or so with the opening of this. And I believe the situation is similar in Summerley on the border with Hampshire, and certainly the Verwood area. So I'd just like to think that, you know, if we do move forwards to any further restrictions due to a second spike or localised lockdown, that we do consider the impact of our waste and recycling. Thank you.
Councillor Spencer Flowers, would you like to make any comment?
Yeah, I'll just comment on a couple of points. The green waste collection, as we all know, we reintroduced once we were content we had the resource to do it. And I think that was a very important decision. As far as HRCs are concerned, and I've had the privilege of being on the end of a Teams meeting with upper tier council leaders for the last 7 or 8 weeks, and we had to have a coordinated approach to the reopening of HRCs. As Mike said, particularly the cross-border provision, you can't open them in Dorset if they don't open them in Hampshire. So it was very important that we did that in a very coordinated way. I think it's been, apart from the queuing aspect of it, I think it's been quite a successful outcome in Dorset particularly. But I know that the 2 cross-border provisions in Millams has been very problematic, and so is Sommerley. I understand, just as an addition to that, that I think it's in a week or so's time, Hampshire will be introducing a booking system, which will also apply to Dorset residents who use Sommerley. So hopefully it will start to have a bit of an impact on not having queues all the way down to B381. But other than that, I think some lessons can be learnt around the closure of HRCs. We did have a bit of a look at fly tipping. I think there's some hot spots around Dorset, but overall, again, the view expressed by my colleague leaders across the country is that fly tipping didn't actually increase any more than say a year-on-year comparison. But I do take the point that not having an HRC open is an encouragement for people to fly tip. Thanks, Chairman.
Thank you. Mike Parks.
Yeah, nothing further to add, and appreciate the comments, Chairman.
Thank you. I just have a few questions. My first one is to Councillor Spencer-Flowers. It's in relation to the decision that was made, and rightly so, to implement getting people who are currently homeless off the street and into a safe dwelling during this pandemic. Although I'm sure many of us would like to see a homelessness a thing of the past sooner rather than later. But that we are all aware that quite often people who are homeless suffer with other issues, if that be health, mental health, or possibly substance use, or many other things that can either be associated with homelessness or cause it. And my understanding is that we have placed all of our homelessness community as a generality into one hotel, and that has caused possibly these social issues in that environment and also in the local area to be exacerbated. I was just wondering if that wasn't one reason to possibly reconsider this decision. Then the other is it right for us to move someone who is homeless from their community, wherever that may be in Dorset, to another locality when they may have possible support networks in that location already, even if they aren't currently living in a dwelling?
So would like me to react, Piers? I'm not going to say very much.
I think it's probably most appropriate, as obviously Graham.
Yeah. No, I understand. I've had representations from a few colleagues around this particular problem, and I've got a bit of detail in my mind about it. We reacted to not government guidance, but we reacted to instruction to get homelessness people off the streets and so on, and which is what we did. And again, as I said earlier today, we had about 2 or 3 days notice to do that, so really difficult, and we had to rely on hotels, for example, being willing to do that, and of course a very small number willing to do it. I think in, for example, one town there are 3 hotels as opposed to 1 that are being used. But perhaps I can hand over to Matt Prosser and then maybe Laura to fill in a bit more detail, please, Chairman.
Of course.
Chair, I think Laura and I have the same details, so I'm happy to look for Laura to lead, and I'll come in if necessary.
Thank you.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. So, yes, as a result of the restrictions that the government introduced due to the pandemic, the council was required to accommodate rough sleepers and also those who were presenting as homeless. Which caused an unprecedented demand, really. It's there are lots of reasons that we've seen that increase in demand. The government put laws in place to prevent evictions, but some people were living in shared accommodation without a tenancy agreement, paying their rent in cash, so they were asked to leave because they then couldn't pay. Others might have been sort of sofa surfing or living in a spare room and asked by the person they were living with to leave because they themselves needed to shield. Could be due to a relationship breakdown, whether that's between parents and their older children who are at home or between couples. And also add to that that the housing market was effectively closed to new renters, so people just couldn't find accommodation in the ways that they normally would. So it became apparent quite quickly there are rapidly increasing numbers of people presenting as homeless. And with the closure of the hotel and guest house market, obviously urgent need to secure accommodation. So prior to the restrictions, there were already 74 households in B&B accommodation. And at the moment, there are 147 people in B&B accommodation. So since the restrictions have eased, some people have been moved into alternative temporary accommodation, into a social rented property, or found their own accommodation in the private sector. And we are urgently working to get people into alternative accommodation. Each case, and I think this is really important, each case is still allocated to the former district or borough area that the resident would have come from. And for the council to accept a duty to someone, they must have a local connection. Sometimes people have no local connection to Dorset, and then in that case they've been reconnected back to their own local area, and in some cases they've been driven by our transport guys. So just to give you an overview, the current figures of the 147 people that are accommodated, 72 have a connection to Weymouth and Portland and are in B&B accommodation there. 38 have a West Dorset connection, and 34 of those are in Weymouth. 12 have a North Dorset connection, and 9 of the 12 are in Weymouth. 7 have a Purbeck connection, and 2 are in Weymouth. 17 have an East Dorset connection, and 4 are in Weymouth. So you can see those numbers and they speak for themselves. There is a severe shortage of suitable temporary accommodation. A number of hotels, caravan parks have been contacted. Most have said they would only be prepared to take key workers, but others have furloughed staff and were applying for loans. And so they had worries that if they took our homeless households, that would impact on the financial support they could have. So there were only a small number of hotels who were actually prepared to offer support, and those primarily in the seafront area of Weymouth. So we continue to try to make contact to get alternative accommodation, and our officers working really hard to find alternative provision away from there, working with MHC on a longer term solution to provide settled accommodation. And I know that Rebecca Kirk and her team.
I appreciate that obviously these decisions are being made quickly and obviously, and to quote Matt Prosser here, at pace. And therefore, I imagine in a lot of cases, well, we have an offer of a suitable location which we can use to home these individuals. And I also appreciate that overnight, we're looking at 100% increase in that demand for a service which I think many of us would describe as overstretched anyway. And I know that Graham Carr-Jones, along with a group of councillors, are looking at how we can find a more long-term sustainable solution to that. But the question, I think, it really comes down to, is it really right to have moved someone who lives I'm going to pick on North Dorset because that's the area of the world which I represent, to Weymouth, where that travel time is the best part of an hour in a motor vehicle, and taking them away from their support network? We are all struggling with the lockdown and what that's doing to our own our own mental health in terms of lack of communication with people that we enjoy spending time with and we care about. And my question is, could we not really have put more effort into finding more localized support for those individuals? Because it just feels wrong, even if we had to base them in Weymouth for a little while. And then I was hoping you might be able to outline some of the mitigation measures we might have put in place to support the local community where these social issues have arisen.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, again, I'm sort of straying into someone else's portfolio, but briefed on it and working with them, because much of the issues cross across into health and adult care. So I think you're right. I think in an ideal situation, those people would be accommodated near their own networks. I know that our housing officers are really keen. They're really passionate about what they do, and they don't want to uproot people. Under normal circumstances, we do sometimes have to uproot people, and it's far from ideal, and it's far from ideal at the moment. And I think you said, is it right? I don't think it is right, but I think the alternative is that they have nowhere to live. And so at the moment, it is not ideal, but it is the best that we can do. And do I think that more effort could have been put into finding places closer to people's homes? No, I don't think more effort could have been put into it. I think the level of effort and kind of resource and really just desperately trying to find those people somewhere to live within their own community could not have been greater, but we have not been able to do that. I also think, I know that Rebecca Kirk and her team are working on mitigation plans with the local communities, and those are multi-agency, constant contact with the police, constant contact with my own teams in social care, with our partners in health if there are drug issues, things like that. So whilst I accept that it is very far from ideal for these people to be housed in Weymouth when their support networks are elsewhere, that is where much of the housing and much of the support resource is as well. So we also have tried to link people up to what is to them a new community, but nevertheless a community. And I have instances of people who have perhaps, I tried to be a member of all the local Facebook groups, and in the Weymouth Facebook group, people have said, right, help, I'm here in temporary accommodation, and they have just been embraced by their local community. So even though they might be in their normal, they're somewhere else.
Thank you. I'm very content with the rationale you've used to come to the conclusions you have. I know Matt Prosser would like to make some comments, so I would love to hear from Matt.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Councillor Miller. As you say, this is working in Councillor Graham Carr-Jones's portfolio of housing, and the housing team working incredibly hard. For those of you who do follow the daily announcements, you will have heard Dame Louise Casey, who is the government's housing czar, speaking about the homelessness strategy that they're putting in place. This is a long-term aspiration. There is significant money being put behind it, and we will, as Dorset Council, be bidding for that. But that's a long-term position. And I absolutely understand that for those communities on the ground who have seen those numbers increase rapidly as a result of the global pandemic and an instruction from government, that we do need a quicker strategy to deal with and to support those communities. So Rebecca Kirk, Corporate Director for Housing under Vivian Broadhurst, is working on that exit strategy, and we'll be considering that this week. And as soon as we can, we will publish that and make members aware, particularly local members in those areas who have been affected.
Thank you. My next few questions all relate to a theme. You can see I've done my homework here, and that theme is communication. So I was hoping to start with looking at our methodology or our aspirations, as it were, in terms of external communication out to the community. Now, Spencer, I know you headed that up because we've spoken about it briefly in the past. I was wondering what you felt your assessments were of that strategy and where we've done well and where we could do better.
Well, thank you very much, Chairman. Well, certainly the online stuff has been going out almost by the hour, and we're keeping members informed, but also I think you're absolutely right to be concerned about how we communicate with the public. We do press releases, and of course you depend on whether the papers decide to use them or not. And we've got the other thing that's actually quite an important medium for getting stuff out to our public is the Dorset Council News, which of course we've had to put on hold. And we will be doing one. I believe we're going to do one in September time. I think that's so we penciled a date in to do that, which is a very good opportunity to, on this occasion, to give people a bit of an insight into all the things we've done as a council to react to the pandemic. So there's a whole raft of different ways of doing it, and I suspect none of them are perfect, but as a package, we'd like to think that we get to most people. I mean, I can tell you now that as a result of what happened yesterday, for example, I've had quite a number of emails from people I don't know, which I think demonstrates that there'll be a lot of other people that have seen stuff we put out that won't bother. So I think it's a good litmus test that we are actually connecting in the way I believe, and I'm sure all of us believe, we ought to be doing with our communities.
So you used the phrase information by the hour. Were you ever concerned that you might drown people in news? Because as a councillor, we receive a copy of all press releases, and there was a very significant stream of them.
What I would say to you on that one, and I'm quite happy and quite willing to stick my head above the parapet here by saying I would rather there was more news than not enough. I think I'd rather give you more than you need as opposed to being accused of not doing enough. And I think the comms team have been incredible during this period of time anyway. And you'll know that many of them have worked 7 days a week. So we've been able to continue that relationship with our communities all the way through and not had weekends off. So massive credit to them. But it was, if you like, a policy decision by me in consultation with others that I won't be accused of not telling people enough.
Okay, thank you. I think that was worth giving you the opportunity to highlight, because I think it is something which the comms team have excelled themselves, and I think our social media offering has been incredibly impressive over. Well, it's been getting progressively better, but in this sort of pandemic, it has come into its own. So I just wanted to give you really an opportunity to flag learning in positive and negative from this meeting as well. The next set of questions I have, which may be more appropriate for Councillor Laura Miller, is in relation to our communication through the volunteer network. And earlier in this meeting, we've highlighted why we didn't want to run a separate system, and we wanted to sort of work in partnership with the volunteer network. My concern is that I had many residents contact me saying that they had signed up either as a group or as an individual and had received no or little communication from them. I was just wondering what the process was behind the scenes there.
Thank you, Chair. Do you mean when a group signed up with the volunteer network and then what happens?
Yes, correct.
Yeah. Okay, so we did have some problems initially. We were working with a range of partners, Age UK, Volunteer Centre, and we did have some problems initially sort of setting up that response and people's expectations on what was going to happen next. I think, that's certainly some learning that I will take away from that. I think now we have a system in place that's clear. We phone people, we send out an email. I remember a conversation that I had with the team saying, we need an auto response, we need to set these things up. So I think going forward, it's a really good point. And we also need to manage our volunteers' expectations if they haven't been called on. We've touched on that in this meeting. And I think it's important because the shielding is going to go on till the end of the year, I think. And, we may need those people, or people will be returning back to work who have been volunteering. So I think it's really important that we continue. I've been doing sort of blog updates that have gone out, and I think people have liked those, and they've gone out to the volunteer community sector as well, specifically, just to say that you're valued and to set out sort of quite clearly what we're going to, even if you haven't been asked, the sorts of things that we might ask you to do. So yes, learning from that, but I'm confident in our ongoing strategy.
Okay, and obviously a number of weeks ago I contacted you on behalf of one of my community groups, and you very kindly set up after about 8 weeks of us being in the Operation Shield a webinar and therefore a two-line communications between our community groups and ourselves as this local government that was helping coordinate in a Dorset sense the response.
Yeah.
I was just wondering, because we don't seem to have had any more of those, and the feedback we got was they're very useful. And the other question is, have the minutes yet been circulated from that? Because after 2 weeks, we're yet to receive those. And I don't want to say that words are good, but actions are better on this front, and communication in my mind is key if we're going to work with the volunteer sector to overcome this. And I hope you would agree with me, the only way we are going to overcome this is if we work with the volunteer sector.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. Just a couple of things on there. Yes, we are going to be doing more volunteer community sector webinars. It's important not to tread on the toes of the Volunteer Centre and Dorset Community Action Network because they're doing a lot of operational webinars. So, how do I set up a bank account for my community group? How do I, all of those kinds of things. So I don't want to I don't want to tread on their toes, but I want to do sort of single issue webinars, and those will be coming up in the next couple of weeks. They do take a bit of prep, who's going to be on the panel, and we wanted to get some good feedback from the first one as well. Just a quick, so basically, yes, that will be happening, and I agree with you that it's essential that it does. Just on your point about the webinar being the method of feeding back into the Community Shield work, very early on in the Community Shield meetings that Teresa and I were leading, we established an email address that fed directly into our Community Shield daily meetings. Those meetings then went down to 3 times a week, then twice a week, and we now meet once a week, you know, with catch-ups in between. But initially it was a daily meeting held at lunchtime, and so we were very, very keen. Laura Cornett, who's been an officer who's been doing a huge amount of work on this, actually sent out that email address to all Dorset councillors and community groups to say, if you have a specific concern whilst we are in this crisis and this initial reaction, please email us directly. Laura Cornett was monitoring that inbox, and we can then raise your issue live at our midday Community Shield meeting. So whilst it's correct to say there wasn't an interactive webinar set up very promptly, I will completely agree and learn from that. It's not correct to say that there was no way of getting in touch with those daily meetings, because we provided that email address quite early on, because we were aware we didn't want people to feel that there was no way of contacting and feeding into that group.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I know you have to run, Laura, so can I just thank you on behalf of everyone for your time today, and hopefully we should be finishing up reasonably soon, but thank you for your attendance today.
No problem at all, and thank you for the questions, they're welcome.
No worries. My last question is to Aidan. Obviously, your role as Gold Commander is one of communication both with our partners and then obviously disseminating that information back out through our organisation to make sure that we are getting we're doing the bits that we're effectively promising to do for our partners in our response. Could you just lead me through what your thought process is on the importance of communication within the organisation and externally?
Yes, thank you, Chair. So in terms of thought processes, if I can actually talk you through the actual process, just to give you a sense of the the rhythm of which we operate. So the Gold network, the strategic coordination group meets or has been meeting 3 times a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and we take information that has been gathered at that point, digest it, and any actions coming are quickly disseminated through the relevant partner organisations. So Gold meets 3 times a week. Silver, which is the more operational leads, where the operational decisions are made, such as be it road closures or coordinating PPE, they have met at a similar frequency as well. And any issues that the silver level officers have been unable to resolve, that's what gets escalated up to the Gold for decision. I think within Dorset Council, the other important element for me has been what we call the incident management team. And now that team, once again, meeting virtually, that's about 25, maybe on occasion 30 colleagues from across the council who have met for an hour and a half each Tuesday morning. And it's that sense of eyes and ears of the organisation. So an opportunity for me as Gold to hear from representatives of each operational service of what their issues they're grappling with, and for them to escalate problems up to me, but also for me to pass through the messaging of what's happening within the organisation. So as you're getting a sense here that we're building up a picture, and then the key element of it has been the senior leadership team, which has at times been meeting on a daily basis to bring together all that information, all that intelligence to understand what Dorset Council needs to do to support the residents, as well as how we're interacting with our partner agencies, be it fire, ambulance, police, or indeed NHS. So to be honest, for many colleagues, the day job has ceased. It's become very much this operational communication has been the absolute key, and all of this at a time when we're working remotely from home. So what or home for majority of formerly office-based services, what that's really felt like for many colleagues has been back-to-back video conference calls such as this from 7 or 8 in the morning through till sort of 7 or 8 at night. And then many colleagues, the operational ones, working throughout the weekends and overnight as well. So communication has been the absolute key to this, and it's got to continue as well. So, a real credit to all those colleagues that have been involved.
I think we're reasonably in alignment that communication is key there. So then my follow-up question really is, how much do you regret that our ability to communicate with SVPP has caused a 10-day delay in business grants being distributed out?
So I'm not sure. So to explain to colleagues, the Dorset Council businesses are either supported by the Dorset Council Revenues and Benefits team, or indeed the Stour Valley and Pool Partnership, depending on their location within Dorset. And rather ironically, it's the Revenues and Benefits team who previously have been gathering money. They're the ones that have been processing the payments to to those businesses. In terms of direct control and line management, I was able to have day-to-day conversations with our team within Dorset Council who have been making those payments, and they're able to do that process online. Stour Valley Pool Partnership, as Councillor Turner mentioned earlier, they took a slightly different approach in terms of communication and sort of initially more manually based process. So whilst they got their information out faster,
BCP took that approach, not SVPP.
SVP provided the services on behalf of the whole BCP and indeed ours. I think rather than we haven't had the post-mortem on that yet. I think we really need to understand if the different approaches that the two councils have taken led to a different performance, and whether there are any lessons to be learned there.
Well, respectfully, in terms of people that run businesses, most of them will know that in most cases it isn't lack of funds which kills you first, it's cash flow that gets you first, and I'm sure you appreciate that with your finance hat on. So therefore, ensuring that those life-saving, in terms of a business, grants made it to them, a 10-day delay is the difference between a business making it and a business not making it. So I don't believe this is something that we should wait for 6 months down the line, especially as we look at our discretionary grants process we're putting in place now. We need to learn these lessons now so we can get them right for this time around, because businesses in the former East and North Dorset should not have a different service to the ones from the old West Dorset, Purbeck and Weymouth and Portland area. I'm sure you would agree with that. I want to go back to my question of where was the issue where SVPP are asking for a way of being able to make payments from Dorset Council, because Dorset Council was holding that grant money from central government, and not receiving it, when we are paying money out of our own Revs and Ben services for the west of the county. The money is leaving the bank account. We put a press release out on the 9th of April saying that we'd already processed 9.1 million, whereas at that point SVPP had no way of paying Dorset Council's grant money.
So in terms of your point about learning the lessons, I think, as I mentioned earlier, the discretionary grant fund for Dorset councils is now entirely being run by Dorset councils, so that we know that it's within our gift to make sure that money is processed as quickly as possible. So I think that's a real step forward. In terms of the 10-day delay, I'm not sure what the particular source of information you've got on that information. I think the actual payments to all Dorset businesses came through the Dorset Council payment system and process. But in terms of the processing of the validation of whether those claims were valid, that came for the East and North Dorset councils, that came from SVPP. And indeed, we did get them at different paces. Some of that could be depending on the nature of the application process. So I think in terms of everybody having to work at pace to be as effective as we can, as I said earlier, we've got 97% of those grants out and £92.4 million paid now. But we will have a review of that once the dust has settled. My main priority now is to make sure that this next round of funding gets out the door as quickly as possible.
Yeah, well, in terms of the source of that information, it's the head of SVPP, the head of the Joint Committee, and the head of the Scrutiny Committee for SVPP is where I'm getting that data from. I'm going to do something a little unusual. I'm going to give you my opinion on why this has happened. I think that this, and it comes back to a quote from a senior officer at SVPP that says, in the last year, we've no longer been consulted on processes, we've been informed on processes. When they're the ones that are enacting them, I believe we should consult with them, as they aren't just a body to do administration for us, they're the ones that are the experts. So actually, I think the issue has come because of a disagreement between individuals at Dorset Council and SVPP. This is something we all know has been brewing in the background, and it's now actually affecting our residents. And I think that's the point where we need to flag this, and it needs to stop.
Sorry, Chair, could you elaborate a little bit more? What's the 10 days delay that you've been informed of? What's the point?
The point is they had the information ready on a number of grant applications that had come in. They requested a payment way of making those payments because that money is sitting in a Dorset Council bank account. i.e. SVPP need to get the information from them to you so you can do the backs run or whatever payment processing you use. And this is all they have to wait 9 or 10 days while we're putting press releases out that 9.1 million quid had gone out to businesses where nothing for East and North Dorset had gone out. There should not be a disparity in service depending on your geographical location within Dorset Council's area.
Yeah, well, so on a particular, this is information that's new to me about a 10-day delay, and so I'd be really grateful if you could share that information with me, because it needs to be, as you rightly say, needs to be looked at. And so perhaps this is an area you want to explore in more detail at a later point.
I will be. I will be requesting that we set up a working group to look into this. Councillor Sumper, who, for other people who aren't aware, is also the chair of the SVPP Scrutiny Committee, would like to make a comment, and then I'm going to look to try and move on from this subject, and we'll set up a working group if that's okay. Councillor Sumper.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Yes, obviously I'm aware of the points that you have made, and I have requested that Stour Valley Pool Partnership, as it is going to be having its own scrutiny meeting. That should be happening in the next couple of weeks, and we will obviously be looking at these issues that you brought up today, which have been affecting businesses and residents in North Dorset and also in the other areas in East as well. As soon as I've got that date, I will let you know.
Okay, thank you. And my only last comment is to everyone involved, and that is that I've been nothing but impressed with the speed and agility that Dorset Council has reacted to this crisis. And I hope that's a speed and agility that we can, in some form, maintain as we look to reset. So what I'd like to suggest now is we need to come up with some form of conclusion, committee members. I think we need to do. I think we need to thank the people of Dorset Council for their response, because many have gone above and beyond the call of duty. I was wondering if any committee members feel strongly on whether we should draw a conclusion on the effectiveness of our response, because that's what we have been asked to do as per the recommendation. And then the last thing I'd like to do is that we set up any working groups to take deeper dives into some of the subjects that have been raised, possibly not fully fleshed out. Obviously, the SVPP issue is one that I'd like included on that list. So, members of the committee, are there any thoughts? Anybody?
Piers, I'm happy that we, or I'm quite happy to propose that we accept the report, noting the comments of members, and the officers and members of the cabinet that have responded to us.
Okay, so would you be happy to throw some thanks in?
Yeah, Piers, yes, I'd be happy to throw some thanks in there. So we have the recommendation before us. Before that we say that we have been, we would like to record our thanks to all of the staff and all of the members of our communities that have been involved in this response, that we are encouraged to hear that Dorset Council intends proactively to learn what it can from the work that we've done so far, and that we are confident that we will be able to maintain and carry on this a good response as the crisis or as the situation unfolds. Something along those lines.
Sounds very sensible to me.
Did anyone write that down?
Ellen, I'm hoping you did.
Of course.
Excellent. And as I said, I'd like to propose we set up a working group to look into the SVPP issue. Are there any other subjects that members would like a working group set up to look into?
I don't know that I necessarily want a working group, but I would like to be reassured that the various comments on comms are not just going to get lost in the ether. There is certainly work that needs to be done to make sure that while we've all agreed that our comms has been superb, there is still work to be done to make sure that it carries on being superb and that we take the learning forward into the new world order. So I would like to just make sure that that is recorded here, even if it's not actually a working group.
Can I comment?
Matt Cross has indicated that he's happy to take that on board, and what I would think is that we use the minutes as a record of our comments for learning to be taken from, and obviously the items that relate to health are going to be going to Councillor Jill Haynes's health committee as well. So if everyone is happy with that, to summarise, we are going to thank members of staff and the community of Dorset for their response. Our sort of summary of our effectiveness is outlined in the minutes, and we're going to look to set up a working group to analyse the SVPP issue, which we will populate offline between the committee and possible other experts from outside of our committee, if that's okay. Before we take that vote, I know Spencer Flowers is indicating he'd like to speak.
Well, just two things actually, Chairman. One is that I've got the portfolio for comms, and I've picked up on the points, very sensible points, good positive comments. Jen and I'll take that away and we'll have a look at it and make sure we learn any lessons we need to learn, and just make sure, as Sherry just said, I think we've had a good comms experience, but you can always learn, and that's a continuing learning process. And while I've got the opportunity, Chairman, can I just thank you and all the rest of the committee for a thoroughly good scrutiny meeting. All of you have made really good positive contribution, and I'm sure the council will benefit from it. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Any final comments before we have a vote of some description?
Chairman, yes, I'd like to actually perhaps have some kind of monitoring of the well-being of our elderly residents going into the future. As I mentioned earlier, my concern is about coming through this and how things are going to develop for those of particular age. And I was thinking perhaps introducing some kind of monitoring in order to see exactly what can be done to help them through perhaps their mental well-being if that's been affected by all of this. So just a suggestion on my part. Thank you, Jim.
How would we turn that into a tangible resolution for the committee to make? I'm thinking if there's something we should ask our colleagues in our health scrutiny to look at with the partners in the CCG.
Yes, I would recommend that. Yes.
Okay, so we'll ask our colleagues in health to look into that. Thank you. Any other comments before we go to a vote?
No, thank you, Chair. I'm good.
Okay. Does anyone need any clarification on what we're voting on? Okay, so I'll just take a sort of, is everyone in favour? If you could sort of yell en masse.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Is there anybody who is against? And is there anybody who's abstaining? Okay. Then those resolutions are passed. I'd like to end by thanking everyone for coming today. Thank you for members of the committee. Thank you for everyone who was on the panel and any members of the public who've watched this to the end. Thank you very much, and enjoy the nice weather while it lasts.